Zoom. Hope everybody is feeling well and doing okay. And to everybody watching on Facebook or on YouTube, it's a pleasure to have you with us this afternoon. Hope that you're doing well as well. Um, this afternoon, we're going to continue our work on the book of Psalms. And I'd like to present a very interesting psalm which raises some really interesting literary questions and some theological questions as well. So this afternoon, we're going to be working on Psalm number 19. If you happen to have a Bible, you'll find it right there in the book of Psalms. If you don't, I put it up on the screen and you can follow with me. Now, there's a bit of controversy about this psalm because it appears to have two very distinct parts. And there's a big conversation among scholars about whether we have here one psalm or whether we actually have two. Rather, was this one psalm that was fused together, or do we have two very distinct hymns, two very distinct words of prayer that were put together and really don't belong together? They were just put together sort of by accident. Scholars debate this sort of thing. I know this might not keep you up at night, but given the world, maybe it would be something that would be a good distraction. So let's take a look together. The beginning of the psalm, for the leader, it's a psalm of David. For the leader, that's just the address to the orchestra conductor. So this is obviously a psalm that was sung in the old temple, in the ancient temple of Jerusalem. It was sung by the Levites, and it was sung at some occasion. I have a guess about when it was sung, and you'll see that in just a minute from the content of the psalm. But it's an interesting psalm, and particularly because the reason I chose this psalm, you'll see in just a moment, is because this week we are beginning the reading of the Torah all over again. Simchat Torah was on Saturday night and Sunday, and that makes this week Parshat Breshit. This week is the week of Genesis, the week of Breshit, and this is the week that we celebrate the beginning of the reading of Torah. So let's take a look together. For the leader, a psalm of David. The first part you're going to see is a song about nature. It is specifically a song about the sun. And what's so very interesting about this part of the psalm is that in Mesopotamian religion, the religion of the Assyrian and Babylonian empires, as well as in Egyptian religion, the sun played a very, very important role. It's obvious why it would, of course. If you're looking in nature for powers to identify as gods, then the sun is the most obvious power. It's the most powerful and most obvious inhabitants of the heavens. Its light and heat reaches every corner of the world. If you're going to worship something in the world, you worship the sun. And sun worship is very popular, very powerful. Shamash, or we call it Shemesh, it was the sun god of the Mesopotamians. Ra was the sun god of the Egyptians. By the way, that's the origin of the name of the Pharaoh, right? The name Masas, or Moses, means son of, and you add that to the name of a god, so you take Ra Masas and you get Ramses. Ramses is the son of Ra, son of the sun god, child of the sun god, as it were. And what the biblical author is going to do here is something really powerful, given the cultural context in which the writer is creating the psalm. He is also going to write a song about the sun, but he's not going to see the sun as a god. He's going to see the sun as a servant of the god. That is, for the biblical mind, the God is above nature. And all of the heavenly hosts, all of the stars, the moon, the sun, all of the phenomenon of nature that surround us are windows into the will of God. They're also servants of God. They're things that God has placed in the world, but they themselves are not God. You don't worship the sun, you don't offer sacrifices to the sun, but you can look at the sun as an object of wonder. And from the sun, you can look through, as it were, that object, that phenomenon, and see a creator whose work you can perceive. So let's begin at the beginning. Here you have a parallelism, as we become familiar with. It's actually chiastic. It's actually an X. The heavens declare the glory of God. The sky proclaims his handiwork. Okay? And now the next part is really kind of interesting. Day to day breathes utterance. Now, so what he's talking about here is the cycle, the diurnal cycle, the day-night cycle. It's like the cycle of day leading into day as it were, has a voice and speaks God's glory into the world. Night to night speaks out. There is no utterance. There are no words. Their sound is unheard. So this idea that you'll find elsewhere all over the book of Psalms, that all of nature sings a song to God, that all of nature joins us in worship, that in a certain way, that worship is the most natural thing in the world. When we worship, when we are acknowledging a creator, when we are expressing gratitude and connection to a creator, we're actually joining everything that's alive and everything that's in the world, not just alive, but everything that's in the world. So the notion being that if you had sufficient sensitivity, if you had sufficient acuteness, you could hear the morning sky praising God, and you could hear the evening sunset praising God. Like all of nature, all around us, everything is singing this song to the Creator. But we don't. We're not that way. Usually we're too busy. You know, the sunset comes and we put the sun visor down in front of our faces on the car because it hits the windshield of the car, and we miss the beauty of the sunset. I don't know if you got outside the other night, but there was just a glorious sunset outside the other night. Unfortunately, it's probably caused by all the schmutz in the air from the fires we've experienced, but the sunset was certainly beautiful. So the psalmist begins with this idea that the heavens and the sky are declaring the glory of God, that they're not gods themselves, but they're windows into the presence of the Creator, and that although we can't hear them, they too are praising God, which is what we're about to do. And here you have a complete opposition, because there's no utterance, no words, their sound is unheard, but their voice carries through the earth, their words to the end of the world. So if you could hear them, wherever you were in the world, you could put your ear up to the sky, put your ear up to the world, and you could hear the song of the world. You could hear the morning song or the evening song of the sky praising the Creator. And so that when we stand up to praise, we're simply joining with all of nature. And now he's going to turn to the sun. For the sun, he set up a tent in the sky. God sets up a tent, and now there's a beautiful anthropomorphic image here. He set up a tent. So the sun lives in a tent in the sky, right? And like the groom, he comes forth from his chuppah, from his canopy, exults like a warrior, running his course. His rising place is at one end of heaven, and his circuit reaches the other, and nothing escapes his heat. So the poetry here is a simile, and the simile is that that the sun in the morning is like a young man, and this young man wakes up in the morning and emerges from his tent the way that a young groom emerges from his wedding canopy on the morning after his wedding, filled with energy, filled with life, filled with with strength, and runs across the heavens and reaches all the way to the other side when he goes back into the tent. And that's the image. Nothing escapes his heat. But the sun itself is only a servant of God, because it was God who set this whole thing up for the sun. So I think that you could see that this must have been a morning prayer, that this must have been something that accompanied the morning prayer, because the whole notion is that the morning itself is a praise of the Creator who gave us this new day. Here's the break in the psalm. The psalm breaks in the middle, and now we have a completely different notion, a different theme that's picked up. It's all about the teaching of the Lord. Now, is this one psalm or is this two? Well, it certainly seems to be two, because the beginning is all about natural phenomenon, and the end, the second part, is all about spiritual phenomenon. The beginning is about the sky and the earth and the sun, and the second part is all about the Torah, basically the Word of God. Professor Nahum Sarna of Brandeis University, in his commentary on the Psalms, makes a very strong case that these were put together on purpose. First of all, the first part was a repudiation of the Canaanite or Mesopotamian or Egyptian idea that the sun is itself a god. But more than that, he says that what we have here are the two parts of human existence. That part of us responds to the world of nature, and part of us responds to the voice of conscience or the voice of spirit. Part of us is physical, and part of us is spiritual. That's one way to think about it. The other way to think about it is that if, especially this last part with the sun, that if you're talking about light, if you're talking about the power of light, then what the psalmist is trying to do is to talk about the power of light, but to say that there's a greater power of light in the world, even greater than the sun. And the power of light that's even greater than the sun is the light of Torah, is the light of God's word, as it were, is the light of God's instructions. He offers this. It's a very strong case, but it's not a case that's accepted by all the scholars, because because obviously you can see that there's a real difference between the two parts of the psalm. So let's move now for a moment. Let's take just a moment and breathe, and let's move to the second part of the psalm. Any questions so far? Any questions, counter sermons, suggestions? Okay, so ready up? Yes, Sheila, hi. Unmute yourself there, please.
I'm unmuted.
Okay, talk to me.
It's very apparent to me right now that all the ancient cultures had similar ideas of how the world began. The Egyptians, the Greeks, the Babylonians.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say so?
Well, that's a wonderful observation. We all share the same basic world, the world of nature, right?
Right.
And we all share the same basic human condition. We're
Right.
born into the world, we're born into families, we grow up in the world. Some of us have siblings. We mature into the world. We bond with each other and marry and create new families, right? We work in the world to make a living. We celebrate the gifts of life, the good things that life presents to us. We suffer with the infirmities of life, getting sick, accidents, various things like that. We get older. Our bodies weaken as we get older, and we die. That's the human condition. Wherever you go, wherever you go. So every human culture, every human culture deals with those same materials, with the outside world of nature and with the inner world of the human experience, the inner world of the human condition. And every human culture asks the same set of questions. The same set of questions is, what's running all of this? Are all of these phenomenon, all these things that happen to me in nature, the sun shines on me, the wind blows on me, the air gets cold in the wintertime, the rain falls, the snow comes, crops grow. Are these all phenomenon? Do they have anything to do with each other? Are they related to each other in some way? Are they expressions of some deeper power that's within that I can't necessarily see, but I can intuit through all the different phenomenon that I go through? And then the second part, which is even more powerful, is this: we all respond to what the inner life is about, right? We all ask the questions, where did I come from? Right? You were a brilliant kindergarten teacher for many, many years. So you got all those kids' questions, and the kids' questions, the questions that a 5-year-old asks their teacher, are the questions that human beings have been asking for centuries, for millennia, right? Where did I come from? Who was I before I was born? How did I end up with these parents, right? How much of me is me and how much of me is my parents? Okay. What is this force inside of me that drives me forward? What is love? What is love? I mean, the Torah begins with the story of where people come from, okay? And then the very next story in the Torah in Genesis is the story of love. God says, Lo tov hayot adam levado. It isn't right that a person be alone, and goes ahead and creates a partner for Adam, and they begin a world together. Well, the question is, how does that work? I mean, what is the great mystery of love? What is the great mystery of illness? And what is the great mystery of death? So all of these questions, you're right, every culture is responding, and every culture arrives at different ways of expressing the answers to the questions. different ways of expressing, different ways of answering the question, and different ways of expressing the answer to the question. And one of the great questions is as you read multiple cultures, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful question, is that, what difference does it make? So if I look outside and I say the sun is a god and the rain is a god and the moon is a god and the night is a god and the day is a god and the grass is a god and the tree is a god, that's one way to answer the question. Each of these has a power, and each of these powers impinges upon me. That's one way to answer the question. It's a pagan way, right? Then there's a second way, which is the way of our ancestors who said, no, these things are all powerful, but there's something more important. There is a unity. There is one creator for all the differences, that behind all of the variety of experiences and the variety of phenomenon, there is a unity, there is a one creator behind all of that. Well, let's stop for a second and ask, what difference does it make if I see one rather than the other? You see? So if I see the world as divided into separate power centers, rain and sun and wind and snow and, then I imagine that they're all at war with each other. But if I imagine that the world is governed by one creator, I can imagine that there's a certain stability behind all of the different things that I see. There's a certain regularity. I go looking for those regularities. And then eventually what's going to happen is I'm going to start to apply the same ideas to human existence. If I see the world as divided into multiple domains, then I can very well say that the rules that govern my morality are not the same that govern your morality. And therefore, if I want to kill you, not you, but if I want to do something untoward to enslave a people, it's okay because we have a different morality than those people, right? They're not really human because they're obviously not the same as us. We're the humans. They're not the ones. They don't belong. You see, so you get these you get these differences in morality that are rooted in the different answers that you give to these very great questions. It's a wonderful way to introduce this thing. And what I'm going to suggest to you is that the book of Genesis, particularly the first chapters, the one that we're reading this week on Shabbat, is a profound and powerful answer to the pagan world that we emerged out of. Because the pagan world that we emerged out of saw everything as fighting against everything else. The origin myths, the origin stories of the pagan world are all about battles, all about wars. And then you get to Genesis, and it's dull. I mean, it's so quiet. God says, let there be light, and there's light, and there's no argument. There's no argument. Like, there's no argument between light and darkness, right? God says, let there be land, and there's no argument between the sea and the land. God says, let there be life on the planet, and there's no argument. And so what's so interesting is that Genesis presents this picture of a world carefully laid out, carefully organized, carefully orchestrated, and then at the very end given to the human being to enjoy. And I'm going to suggest to you that there's a huge difference between that and the notion that the world comes out of a battle, out of a war, out of a conflict. The difference is that if I see the world coming out of conflict, then I'm really reticent to build anything, because I'm always worried that the gods will come and destroy what I build. But rather, when I see the world as coming out of a creator who is beneficent, who keeps saying over and over again, it's good, it's good, it's good, I can say this is a world worth working on. This is a world worth investing in. This is a world worth building, because there's a basis of stability in this world that I can count on, and it's a world that's been given to me to care for. And that's the big difference between these two different ways of answering the question. But you're right, every civilization responded to nature, responded to the human condition, and arrived at its own answers to the great questions of what is life? What is life all about? Okay? Any other comments, questions, counter sermons? Yes, Stan.
You've been my teacher for many, many years. I
We've learned together, put it that way.
right. And I've come now within the last year or so to be attracted to the Tikva Fund and Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik.
Okay.
And there's lecture of his that I just watched. It's on Shabbat and the Jewish holidays, and compares the moon and the lunar calendar that we have with the solar calendar, and of course, which we have the agriculture or whatever. But
Right.
he really comes into the same kinds of conclusions, and he talks about the astronauts on the moon, the Jewish astronauts, the one alone that died, and then the other one who walked on the moon, and brings everything together. But he's
Yeah.
really talking about the same thing that you are. So,
Well, he's a very smart man. That's the truth.
I'll
Right.
send you
Rabbi
the link.
Soloveitchik is the rabbi of the Shereth Israel Synagogue in New York City. He's a columnist for a number of major publications, including the Wall Street Journal. And he's the grandnephew of the famous Rabbi
Right.
Soloveitchik, and he's a very, very
Amazing.
bright
And
man.
they've done so many series of lectures and things. It's really great. You can
Right. He's very good stuff.
And
He
they're
and I come
available.
from very different sort of philosophical and religious traditions, of course.
Yes.
But, we're all looking for meaning in ancient texts, and that's what we're doing. And that's why it's not his answers and my answers. They may differ from each other, but they're in the same basic universe because we're both committed to the text. We're both committed to the biblical text. So let's take a look now at the second half of our psalm, shall we? So here the second half kicks in, and you can see that it's different. And Professor Sarna says, read this in the light of the first one, literally in the light of the first one, right? But this is how he starts. The teaching of the Lord is perfect, renewing life. The decrees of the Lord are enduring, making the simple wise. The precepts of the Lord are just, rejoicing the heart. The instruction of the Lord is lucid, making the eyes light up. Interesting talks, right? Torah Adonai Tamima. So what we have here is very interesting. First, I want to show you something that may just escape your eye. He's not talking about God. I mean, if he were to say, God is perfect, God is enduring, God is just, God is lucid, God is pure, that's what I would have expected it to say. But that's not what he's saying. He's saying something more radical than that. It's the teaching of the Lord that is perfect, the decrees of the Lord that are enduring, the precepts of the Lord are just, the instruction of the Lord is lucid. Now, what's the difference between those two claims? What's the difference between saying the teaching of the Lord is perfect and saying the Lord is perfect? Well, the difference is very powerful. The difference is that when we Jews think about God, we access God through Torah. That's the way we come to God, right? I'll just give you the example because you can see it like right here behind me. When you walk into a church, what is the visual focus of a church? Well, the visual focus of pretty much any church that you're going to walk into is a cross. When you walk in and you face forward, you're going to see a cross. If it's a Catholic church, it's a certain kind of cross. If it's a Protestant church, it's a different kind of cross. If it's a Greek Orthodox church, it's a different kind of cross, because pretty much anywhere you go, it's going to be a cross, because the cross is a reminiscence of the crucifixion, which was the principal event in human history that Christianity is organized about. And the cross represents the greatest act of divine love, that God gave us his only begotten son, and that he was crucified to cleanse the world of sin. The cross represents that place in which we access God. And even the physical structure of a cross, with its horizontal, which represents the world, and its vertical, which represents divinity, defends God, talks about the idea that God is accessible through Christ, through Jesus, through the experience of the crucifixion. Okay? If you've ever been to a great European cathedral, you can feel this. So you go to any of the great European cathedrals. St. Peter's, of course, in Rome is the most grand of all of them, but pretty much anyone, the Duomo in Florence, or the Cathedral of Milan, Notre Dame in Paris, when they open it up again one day, God willing, and you walk in and it's this, 400-foot ceiling, which makes you feel like a worm on the floor, which is what they want you to feel. You're nothing. You're a bug. But the only thing that makes you spiritually significant is as you look up into the cross. And the cross is the symbol that you can access God. You're just a bug, but through the cross, through Christ, you can access God. Now, when you walk into a synagogue, what's the visual focus? Well, I don't have to keep you in suspense. There it is. You see, right? The visual focus of a synagogue is the Aron HaKodesh, the Holy Ark. And what do we keep in the Holy Ark? The Sefer Torah. The Torah is our symbol and our means of accessing God. The idea that a human being living a physical life in this world with all of the vulnerabilities that we talked about and all of the corruptions that we all know about, and yet can still access God, can know divinity, can touch eternity, can get close to that which is realer than real. And the way that we do that is in our tradition through the words of a text, through the words of Torah, that somehow we have the words of God that live among us, and that one can spend one's life engaged with those words, and that something happens to us as we engage with those words. We become more divine in our own sense. We more moral. We become more holy. We become godly. In Rabbi Schulweiss's beautiful phrase, it lifts us up out of the normal flow of our animal existence to experience life in a very different way. And that's what Torah does for us. So what we do is it's a really interesting thing that Jews are much more close. I mean, how do you say this gently? It's like Torah is our proximate access point, our modem, as it were, our connection with God, with our divinity. And that Torah, therefore, takes on the qualities of divinity. That the things we would normally have said about God, we now are going to say about the teachings of God. Now, at a particular moment in our history, this was a critical idea and a controversial idea, as you can imagine. And that moment was the destruction. First, the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE by the Babylonians, which is what this psalm is responding to. And then finally, the destruction of the second temple in the year 70. You see, as long as there was a temple in Jerusalem, there was always a sense that God, as it were, God himself lived in that temple. There was a room in that temple called the Kodesh HaKodeshim. Nobody ever went into that room except the high priest on Yom Kippur. And in that room, it was believed that a presence of God lived in the world, that was the access point, and that therefore God lived among us. That God lived among us. Now, if that's what you believe, that God lives among us and that the temple as a building, as an institution was our access point to God, what happens when it's destroyed? Well, obviously what happens when it's destroyed is that should be the end of Jewish existence. Because if you have a civilization that invests itself in a particular institution and that institution is removed from the world, then your civilization should naturally collapse. But something happened because we had a different way of understanding God, a way of understanding that God is present in the world, not through the agency of the temple, but through the presence of Torah, through the agency of Torah. And that one can access the presence of God through learning Torah and living Torah. That one can know God and internalize God's word through through the internalizing God's presence through the Torah. That gave us the agency. That gave us the possibility of surviving the destruction of the Holy Temple. Right? There are beliefs still that you can only worship God on a place where God has shown up. In the Bible, people worship God in a place where God shows up. Okay, Jacob has a dream. He sees God in the sky and sees a ladder connecting heaven and earth. And he wakes up in the morning, sets up the rocks he's been sleeping on, pours oil on them, and says, "This is Beit El," and that becomes a holy place. Wherever God shows up, that becomes a holy place, a place where one can worship God. The Christian tradition kept this alive, by the way. And the way that the Christian tradition kept this alive was that churches had a reliquary. A reliquary was a treasury, and in the treasury they would have some relic of something saintly. So, for example, every great European church has a splinter from the original cross. Now, what happened was, now if you put all those splinters together, by the way, you couldn't just build a cross, you could probably build a whole church, right? Because what happened is it became a big market for these relics in the centuries following the death of Jesus, because they were trying to build churches everywhere. And they wanted to build a church around something that was a physical representation that God was in the world. So you would either get a splinter from the original cross, or a drop of blood from the Holy Grail, or you would get a bone or a piece of the body of a martyr, of a saint. Right, the most famous one of all is, if you've ever been to Venice, which is just a magnificent place to be. In the middle of Venice, in the middle of the square, of course, is San Marco, St. Mark's Cathedral. And St. Mark is buried in the basement. Now, the interesting thing is that St. Mark died in Constantinople. So what the Venetians did is launch an invasion of Constantinople. They burned Constantinople, stole the tomb of St. Mark's, brought it back to Venice, buried it in the basement, and then built the cathedral on top of it, because you have to have something holy. Now, what happened to us? Well, we do have these holy places. We still go to the Kotel because it's close to where the temple was. And the holy places in Israel are places where miracles had happened or God showed up. But I have really bad news for you. No miracle, no saint, and no splinter of the original anything ever showed up on the corner of Densmore and Ventura, and yet we built a synagogue here. The synagogue became holy not because it was the site of a miracle or a place where God spoke or something miraculously metaphysical happened there. What makes a synagogue holy? That it has a Torah. And we gathered together to learn Torah, and we gathered together to teach Torah, and we gathered together to share Torah, which means it made the tradition portable. You could take this tradition on the road. And any institution, whether the temple or anything else, that is no longer, we're no longer vulnerable, because that institution might be destroyed, because we can carry Torah with us wherever we go. The only problem is when Torah gets outlawed. And that's when you end up with the story, say, of the martyrdom of Rabbi Akiva, when the Romans outlawed the teaching of Torah. That's when he objected and he resisted. Torah gives us the possibility of making our faith portable. So let's go back to the Psalm. So what the Psalm does is identify the Jewish access to the presence of God is now going to be located in Torah. And everything that we might once have said about God himself, we're now going to say about Torah. Right? You could say God is perfect, renewing life, but now it's going to say the teaching of God is perfect, renewing life. The decrees of the Lord are enduring, making the simple wise, bringing wisdom, right? The precepts of the Lord are just, rejoicing the heart. That's an interesting combination, by the way, right? That because they're just, there's joy in the world. But when justice happens, we have a sense of satisfaction that the world is what it ought to be. The instruction of the Lord is lucid. Actually, lucid means filled with light, making the eyes light up. Now, that's a reference back to the original, the earlier statement having to do with the sun. The sun lights the world. It's true, but if you want to know what lights human existence, it's the words of scriptures. It's the words of Torah. And now we're going to switch to a different mode. The fear of the Lord is pure. So all of these things are things God gives us. The fear of the Lord is something that we have within us, our response. So if one is truly respectful, now fear of the Lord, I'm going to tell you what that means. Yirat Adonai, abiding forever. The phrase Yirat Adonai is a beautiful phrase. And it's a phrase that occurs all through the Bible. And if you gather up all of the places where it occurs, it means this. It means conscience. It's conscience. You find it especially in those circumstances where somebody who is an Israelite, one of us, encounters somebody in the world. And the question is there common decency that governs our transaction? I'll give you a couple of examples. There's a story in the book of Genesis where Abraham, there's actually twice in the book of Genesis, Abraham passes off his wife as his sister. The first time he does it in front of Pharaoh, and then the second time he does it with a king named Abimelech. And when Abimelech realizes that the woman that is with Abraham is not his sister but his wife, he goes screaming at Abraham, saying, "What did you do this for? We could have done something really awful here. We could have slept with her." Right? And Abraham says, "I wasn't sure that there was yirah in this place. I wasn't sure there was common decency in this place." Give you a second example. In the story of Joseph, the brothers don't know it's Joseph who's giving him this hard time, right? The brothers don't know that it's him. They think he's just some Egyptian prime minister, this Egyptian bureaucrat. And they go through this whole thing where they steal his Joseph pretends that they steal his cup. He puts the cup in Benjamin's, and then what happens ultimately is that he says to them, "Did you think I'm a person without yirah? Did you think that I'm a person without a common decency?" All through the Torah, this notion of yirah refers to basic common morality, not the morality we gain from learning scripture, but the morality we gain from living in the world. What we would call in America common decency, the thing you expect from each other, common goodness, common decency, common courtesy. But it's different than courtesy. It's more morality. And that's what yirah is. So when it says the fear of the Lord is pure, yirah, which is the basic sense of goodness, of doing what's right, abiding forever, the judgments of the Lord are true, righteous altogether. And then I think that verse 11 refers not just to the judgments, but to all of these things, the teachings, the decrees, the precepts, the instructions, the fear, and then the judgments, right? Everything that God has given to us in order for us to become more godly, more desirable than gold, better than fine gold, sweeter than honey, and the drippings of the honeycomb. And what he's saying is that there's a way in the world that you can live, which is ultimately the right way. It's the right way. And I think that, again, so here Professor Sarna is going to offer us the idea that what's offered in this section parallels with what came before. In the same way that nature has its way, its pattern, its law, human beings have been given a law as well. And that's the law that God has taught us. And now the writer finishes with three things he wants to say. If that's true, and there is a way of human existence which is as firm and important a law as the law of nature, that are there moral laws which parallel the laws of nature, or as important as the laws of nature, then he says, your servant pays them heed, obeying them as much reward. And when I make mistakes, who can be aware of unwitting sins? I know I make mistakes. And this is what's different between me and nature. Nature don't make mistakes. Like there's no exceptions to the law of gravity, not one, right? But human beings, we make mistakes, we make choices, and sometimes our choices are the wrong ones. And when I do an unwitting sin, an unknown transgression, clear me. And from willful sins, keep me and let them not dominate me. Then I shall be blameless and clear of grave offense. Give me the capacity to see myself clearly enough that I can make the choices to hold on to the ways of God and not depart from them. And finally, he ends with the section that's familiar to all because it's at the very end of the Amidah prayer. May the words of my mouth and the thoughts of my heart be acceptable, my rock and my redeemer. So the question is this. It's a very interesting question. We know that there are laws of nature. Gravity is a law of nature. Now, what do you mean by a law of nature? It's not a law of nature. There are patterns in nature which bear out every single time. Gravity is one of them. Okay, Einstein taught us that the speed of light is the only thing that's not relative in all of the universe, 186,000 miles a second. There are laws and rules of nature. Are there laws and rules of morality that are like the laws and rules of nature? If you violate them, bad things happen. Are there laws and rules? And what the psalmist is trying to say to us is, yes, that's the way God set up the world. God set up the world with laws of nature, and God set up the world with laws of morality. And that if you violate the laws of nature, it's always going to be dangerous. Always. And he says, and similarly, if you violate the laws of morality, and that the glory of Torah, the greatness of Torah is that it gives you the laws of morality. They're explicit. You don't have to worry. You don't have to guess what they are. I mean, I've never understood quantum physics, but they tell me that's how the universe runs. But the question is now the laws of morality are given to you explicitly. The only problem is choosing to live them. All right, let's stop for a second. Any questions? Counter sermons? So I'm going to give you a homework assignment, and then we're going to call it an afternoon. So your homework assignment for everybody watching is, all right, we've talked about the laws of nature. What are the laws of morality? If you could think of, is there a law of morality that you would want to teach, let's say, a child and say, look, kid, follow this precept in your life, and you will discover that it's always going to bear out fruit. It's always going to be productive. It's always going to be beneficial. It's always going to bring you blessing. And what are those laws of morality? I'll let you think about that for the week to come. Any last questions before we conclude? All right, dear friends, you take care of each other and stay well. Bill, I'm glad you're healthy. Stay well. David, I'm glad you're healthy. Stay well.
Thank you.
Rhoda, take care. We love you. Bert, Leslie, Stan, Sheila, and everybody watching on Facebook, take very good care. Have a very, very good week, and we'll see you this weekend on Shabbat. Take